Salam sejahtera dan bersama saya Rizal Zulkapli dan ini AWANI Global. Pertubuhan Bangsa Bersatu pada Oktober ini akan menyambut ulang tahun ke-75 penubuhannya dan dengan 193 ahli ketika ini dunia berdepan dengan satu cabaran yang besar iaitu COVID-19. Menurut Antonio Guterres, Setiausaha Agung Pertubuhan Bangsa Bersatu, COVID-19 telah mewujudkan ataupun mengetengahkan kerapuhan dan juga ketidaksamarataan yang wujud di serata dunia pada ketika ini. Dan ulang tahun ini tentunya signifikannya adalah untuk melihat kepada apakah tugas dan juga tanggungjawab Pertubuhan Bangsa Bersatu dan juga meraihkan cerita-cerita sukses yang telah ada bersama dengan Pertubuhan Bangsa Bersatu, namun untuk melihat cabaran untuk bergerak ke hadapan dan juga bagaimanakah negara-negara ahli boleh bergerak ke hadapan bersama dengan Pertubuhan Bangsa Bersatu di dalam tempoh COVID-19 ini menuju kepada tahun-tahun mendatang. Untuk melihat kepada isu ini, kita bersama dengan Stefan Priesner, Koordinator Residen PBB di Malaysia, Singapura dan juga Brunei. Izinkan saya meneruskan dalam bahasa Inggeris. Stefan, hi, thank you for joining us this morning. Stefan, let's look at the UN turning 75. Tell us more about the work that the UN is doing right now, and especially in these very trying times.
First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on the program. Indeed, it's a very critical time, I think, for the United Nations. We are these days celebrating our 75th birthday. This was also the theme of this year's General Assembly that has just taken place in New York. Well, it should have been taken place in New York, but this year, for the first time in the history of the UN, it had to be conducted virtually for obvious reasons, for COVID reasons. But that also meant that a record number of heads of state delivered their messages many of them really congratulated, I think, the United Nations in general on many successes in the last 75 years. Obviously, the mandate that the UN has, meaning maintaining peace, secondly, promoting and protecting human rights, and thirdly, promoting development and humanitarian issues, are so huge that if you look back in the last 75 years, there have been successes and failures. But I think what came out of this session just last week, the last 2 weeks, is that the successes by far outweigh the kind of perhaps failures. Currently, the United Nations helps countries to combat the pandemic and leads the global response of this unprecedented crisis. Number two, the United Nations currently provides food and assistance to 86.7 million people in 83 countries. It supplies vaccines to 50% of the world's children and therefore helps save 3 million lives per year. It assists and protects refugees and displaced peoples, 82.5 million people that have been fleeing war, famine and persecution. It works currently with all nations around the world to keep the global temperature rise in check and below 2 degrees Celsius in the global effort to contain climate change. It keeps peace with 95,000 peacekeepers on the ground in currently 13 operations. It protects and promotes human rights globally through 80 treaties and declarations, and it uses diplomacy to prevent conflict in supporting about 50 countries in elections every year.
And Stefan, I understand, despite all the numbers, is UN an effective global organization? Does it fulfill these mandates that you mentioned earlier? Because I think right now at least 30 countries are still involved in armed conflicts, and 135 million people are living with acute hunger, and the WFP expects that number to increase to 265 million because of the quarantine, because of COVID-19, and also the criticisms towards the Security Council. Is UN still an effective global organization at 75?
That depends on the perspective. Certainly from my perspective, which is ahead of a United Nations operation in a country, I feel that the UN is very often criticized and we are mixing there sometimes the lack of mandate that the United Nations has to intervene, and maybe sometimes the lack of resources to kind of the effectiveness of the organization itself. I think it is difficult to deny that the UN in the last 75 years has, as I said, had huge kind of contribution towards the achievement of those very, very high-level goals. But nevertheless, I agree with you that the picture is not perfect, far from perfect. There are many outstanding issues. There are outstanding issues that have not been solved in the last decades, such as certain wars and conflicts that have been going on. Also hunger has not been defeated, and now what is coming in, and you correctly point this out, is another crisis, a huge crisis that nobody has foreseen, and that is the COVID crisis. And with the COVID crisis comes additional challenges that the United Nations now very quickly tries to put the conditions in place to be able to respond very quickly. So, for example, you were mentioning the significant and dramatic increase in people who go hungry, and it's growing day by day. Our response to that has to, first of all, to raise the funding for that. And there have been within a month of the COVID, when the COVID crisis really kind of proliferated in early this year, there have been already humanitarian calls going out to the world. Countries have contributed, but need to contribute more to be able to enable the United Nations to deal with this sudden surge of, for example, hunger. But certainly we do have, for example, the logistics in place, the programs in place to respond incredibly effectively.
So COVID-19 highlights the importance of a global organization like the UN in helping this to eradicate or to stop this global pandemic. Is that correct?
They can only be taken on by a global organization, obviously always in cooperation with the member states, because the member states are part of the United Nations, but it has to be done in a coordinated way. Otherwise, you cannot deal with a crisis such as COVID-19 that doesn't discriminate between people in one country or people in another country, between different parties that are still perhaps in conflict and war. It doesn't discriminate between those, and we can only sustainably deal with such huge crises in a coordinated way globally.
Bertemu kembali, kita membincangkan berkenaan dengan Pertubuhan Bangsa Bersatu pada ulang tahun ke-75-nya bersama dengan Stefan Priesner. Stefan, let's look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG. September 25th was the 5th anniversary of the SDG. Do you think COVID-19 has affected resources or the efforts to achieve the goals in the SDG? Or do you think more countries realize that there's a need to push the goals faster and to move forward faster because of COVID-19?
First of all, let me kind of point out that the Sustainable Development Goal is perhaps the most comprehensive and I think most well thought out development framework that the UN ever had. I really have to congratulate the drafters of this framework because how they brought together the issues of social development, economic development, environmental protection based on a foundation of good governance is really simply brilliant. So what I think I can say is that the Sustainable Development Goals is a blueprint that many countries can use for a development that is balanced between the different dimensions of development. As I said again, we all recognize that economic growth is the driver, but it will have significant negative effects unless the social area is taken into account at an equal basis and environmental protection is really taken seriously. So the SDGs are a framework that is unprecedented. It has been agreed by all the 193 member states, and with different speed, countries basically took on this framework. To a certain extent, in the context of the SDGs, all countries are now developing countries, because not even the most developed countries can say that they have tackled the issue of inequality or the issue of climate change. And countries like Sweden are working on the SDGs, as is countries such as Malaysia, as is least developed countries in the world. And I think that is also something that needs to be stressed. Despite all the efforts, it was very clear that in the first 5 years the progress was too slow. So on 1st of January this year, Antonio Guterres, our Secretary General, called on the world to kind of accelerate action towards the SDGs, and declared a decade of action, decade of SDG action. Now this was still at the moment when nobody expected COVID to affect the world so dramatically. But as you rightly point out, then COVID hit. And COVID obviously is a significant dent to the SDG achievement. It basically has set the level of SDG achievement back in most of the countries, if not all of the countries.
The Secretary General Antonio Guterres also stated that in his speech that countries least capable to address COVID-19 has received far too little assistance. This was in the speech earlier this month or last month. And also the pandemic has exposed fragilities and inequalities across the globe, biggest economic in terms of the effect on the biggest economic effect, especially job losses since the Great Depression. Are you worried that the goals in SDG 2030 will not be achieved?
Well, I think everybody has to be worried about that, but we believe that the crisis, with all its catastrophic impact, is perhaps also an opportunity. And this opportunity is to get right some of the policies and some of the focus areas that have perhaps before COVID been underestimated. I think what COVID did was it revealed in many countries that certain groups were excluded because of lack of perhaps social protection, or perhaps of possibility to participate in the job market. We saw that the crisis impacted women and girls more than the general population, and so on. So I think the crisis is really an opportunity to review the policy framework of every country and fix those policies that perhaps were kind of seen as not being sufficiently up to date before COVID. This especially relates to the issue of environmental policies, because I think if you look at the overall SDG achievement, those that relate to environment, especially climate change, but also SDG 12, sustainable production and consumption, were those that were really falling behind already before the SDGs. So now the call is, we have to build back better and focus especially on those policies and on incentive systems that these policies are brought into the right kind of direction, so that we still can catch up and achieve the SDGs by 2030.
With many countries focusing on their fiscal policies, more monies are being poured domestically to help the local economies because of COVID-19. Are you expecting resources to be limited to UN bodies, including WFP, WHO, UNHCR? Do you expect this to happen because of COVID-19? More countries are putting monies, resources into their own country through fiscal policies?
I think it's very important to have global solidarity, and we believe that COVID will hopefully increase global solidarity. In the short term, of course, there were perhaps some counter moves on this, but development aid is a relatively small share of the budget of the developed countries. So I think it will have a lot more to do with the focus of policies than about fiscal space. And at this point in time, definitely we are short of funding to address many of the COVID-related kind of impacts and the acceleration strategies. The calls for humanitarian aid, for development aid are out. And we are calling on the world, of course, to really step up, to use COVID-19 not only as a possibility to fix policies at national level, but also to revive international solidarity between the haves and the haves-not.
Bertemu kembali, anda masih bersama saya Rizal Zulkapli bersama dengan Stefan Priesner daripada PBB resident di Malaysia, Singapura dan juga Brunei. Stefan, let's look at the Malaysia and also the SDG goals 2030. PM or the Prime Minister recently mentioned that Malaysia will continue to support the SDG and it is in line with our shared prosperity vision 2020. So let's look at the progress that Malaysia has made so far. What can you share with us?
Okay, so I have had the honor and pleasure to serve in your country for the last 3 years. So it's 3 or 5 years of the SDG period I've been here. And I really have to commend the government and the 3 governments that I basically already had the pleasure of working with for a good commitment to take the SDGs forward. Especially Malaysia has recognized that it's about aligning the planning of the country with the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it has well recognized that the SDGs are flexible. They can be kind of interpreted in a national context, but they have all the principles in place that you can use to sharpen your planning, to ensure that nobody's left behind, to ensure that sustainability is taken forward, to ensure that economic growth takes place in a balanced manner. And I think Malaysia has made a good effort in its 5-year planning, in the national budgets, and with dedicated projects to go for certain gaps in the Sustainable Development Goals. And the United Nations system has been, I think, a good partner of the government, and it has been really a pleasure always to work with the government on this big agenda. Now, I think the general situation is, of course, I don't have yet the post-COVID numbers, but that we have a monitoring system that is maintained by our regional agency, ESCAP, which draws on the data that come from the Department of Statistics Malaysia. And there we can see that acceleration of SDGs is needed also in Malaysia, but that the social group of goals, education, health, poverty reduction, is relatively better scoring than at this point in time the environmental efforts. So we are very happy that PM also mentioned specifically the commitment towards doing more on the environment in line with the SDGs in the recent General Assembly. But I think in general, basically, what is important is that Malaysia has fully understood how to take forward the Sustainable Development Goals. It's not a side agenda. It is the core agenda that needs to be merged with the national agenda, because it's in the national self-interest to tackle issues such as climate change, such as biodiversity protection, and of course poverty reduction and other goals. Then came COVID, and I think it's not a secret that Malaysia has done relatively well in terms of response to COVID, in terms of health, and in terms of the stimulus packages. I think what we now need to look at is how these stimulus packages have affected the distributional patterns, whether the poor in the end basically have been benefiting, or which of the population groups have been benefiting in comparison to others. But I think the first month, were very encouraging.
If you could share with us, what's your conversation with the Malaysian government like when it comes to ensuring the reduction of inequalities, poverty, making sure access to education, economic opportunities like in Malaysia? What's your advice, or what's your conversation with the government like?
I think it's fair to say that the UN has advocated for a long time to review the former poverty line, which was kind of kept. It was in line with the international poverty line, but the argument was always that Malaysia has graduated from, you know, in comparison to many other countries, and needs to adjust the poverty line to that. So we are very, very happy, and we commend the government to recently kind of elevate the poverty line. Of course, the number of poor is now again higher. It's now between 5 and 6%, but that allows the government then also to come in with targeted programs to address those pockets of poverty that exist, and not only Malaysia, they exist in all the countries. I think I should also say that we believe also that the issue of migrants and refugees is an important one in the context of Malaysia. Malaysia has always been a country that, of course, had big groups of especially migrants in the country, has benefited also from them. And we feel that you know, policies need to reach out to also these groups to kind of ensure that they don't fall behind.
And Malaysia has also played a huge role when it comes to global issues. Malaysia is the 46th country to ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was done recently. Malaysia has also sent peacekeeping troops. Malaysia has also, well, criticized the UN for some of the roles of the UN. Do you think this relationship is appreciated by the UN, this relationship between Malaysia and the UN? How do you see that relationship moving forward?
I think Malaysia is a very appreciated, you know, member, and I think the relationship between Malaysia at all levels, at the national level with the UN in Malaysia country team here, but of course also internationally with the many contributions that Malaysia made to the work of the UN, I think is very good, is excellent. You mentioned the recent ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That's very important. We also see it significant that recently Malaysia, also during the COVID crisis, followed the call of the Secretary General for a global ceasefire, and not only kind of endorsed it, but also garnered international support to bring other countries on board. And now 180 countries are already basically in favor of this global ceasefire. And then, of course, there's a relationship in the country that you mentioned peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is a long-term relationship, and Malaysian peacekeepers are a critical part of UN peacekeeping operations, currently also contributing to 2 of the 13 operations that are still active in the world, in Lebanon and Western Sahara. But being the head of the development group here in the country, I also have to say a few things about development, and I think there the cooperation is also really excellent. I mean, we are 19 UN agencies that collaborate with the government. 8 of them, you know, with representational offices in the country. The others working through projects from Bangkok, and covering a wide range of areas throughout the SDGs, from poverty reduction to environmental protection to specific focus on refugees and migrants, to areas such as child protection, UNICEF. So the 19 agencies are collaborating to really support some of these sticky development issues in dialogue and support with the government as one United Nations. And that is my job, to coordinate this family of UN agencies to bring the best possible support of the UN to bear for the sake of the people and the government of Malaysia.
And Stefan, we have about 2 minutes left. UN turns 100 in 2045. What do you hope to see? Because you've been with the organization since the 90s, and now it's 2020. What do you hope to see in 2045? The role of that global organization with 193 members. What do you hope to see when UN turns 100?
Well, I think you know, the world is very dynamic, and it seems to be more and more dynamic as development seems to accelerate. So my vision of the UN is that the SDGs, first of all, are achieved globally, which will mean that this is the best preventive strategy for also conflicts. Because if countries you know, take the SDGs seriously, they will also make it very unlikely that the basically conflicts come about. So I hope, of course, for a world that is peaceful, that is fully developed, and is fully able to respond to shocks, because shocks will be there. I recently saw a very powerful drawing of 3 waves. It was a drawing of 3 waves. The small wave said COVID, the bigger wave said climate change, and the largest of all waves said biodiversity degradation, because we are so interlinked with, of course, life on Earth, that these agendas are huge and they need to be taken on. I am not, I think, a utopian to believe that in 2045 we will have solved all problems, but I think we should have the response mechanisms and the preventive mechanisms in place so that the world is really resilient against shocks and can respond to shocks if they appear.
On that note, we thank you very much, Stefan, for joining us. Today, Stefan Priesner, Koordinator Resident PBB di Malaysia, Singapura dan juga Brunei, dan kami warga Astro AWANI mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun ke-75 Pertubuhan Bangsa Bersatu. Saya Rizal Zulkapli, salam hormat.
Thank you.